Hey, what's up peoples? Hardleg Joe here with the profile for my Witchcrafter / Dogmatika deck, also known as Heresy. Two spellcaster archetypes smashed together, both seeking to stun the opponent in different ways. It's pretty neat. Going over our deck list, we're playing the Giant Space Ribbon from Star Trek Generations, 3 big Hammer Mommies, 1 Fleur de Lure, 1 of the X-Men, probably Wolverine, a Lady Smuggington, her loyal handmaiden, 3 Shitter, 3 Little Hammer Sisters, 3 Genie, the Threenie, if you will, and the Ghost of Dark Magician's Relevancy, may it rest in peace. For spells, we're playing Soup, 3 of Farfa's Servant, 141, 3 Rhoda for Witches, 3 Monster Reborn for Witches, Floodgate Insurance, 2 Brick Insurance, Lefty, Righty, some paperwork, 3 ways to search 2 hands, and an entire fucking street. Our only trap is 3 reasons to play Dogmatika. The only reasons to play Dogmatika, if we're being honest. As for our extra deck, they contain 2 Bastards, 2 Skeleton Warriors, Time itself, Millennium, Omega, a Furry, plus this weird thing I can't describe, and 3 Link 1s of varying usefulness. The side deck I'll go over at the end, because it's not that important. So at its core, this is a control deck, which means it's all about slowing the opponent down and forcing them to waste their resources. It is also a toolbox deck, which means it has more search power than Google. Ecclesia searches any Dogmatika card when she's summoned, and Nadir's Servant searches Ecclesia. Schmitty, meanwhile, can be searched by Witchcrafter Creation, and not only can she summon any Witchcrafter monster from the deck, but she can also put any Witchcrafter spell into the graveyard, which essentially searches that spell, for reasons I'll explain in a moment. My point is, this is why we play so many goddamn 1-ofs in this deck, because most of the cards we do play at 3 can search them all out, so you can kind of tutor what you need for whatever situation you're in. The idea is to play a whole bunch of starters from both archetypes, and just hope you draw into a little bit of each. If you do get both starters, then you can put up some pretty formidable first turn boards. I think the optimal hand gets you 3 negates, 2 destructions, plus battle protection, maybe a little more. I'll show you that combo later. And if you don't get the optimal hand, you should be able to at least get 1 disruption on board, and hopefully that'll be enough to stall you for a turn or 2. Which may not seem like much, for most decks stalling just means losing more slowly, but nearly every Dogmatika card has the potential to be a tide-shifting top deck, and Witchcrafters in particular thrive during longer games, so stalling is actually to their advantage. In fact, let's go ahead and go over the Witchcrafter engine real quick, just so you know what I mean. So, most of the Witchcrafters have effects that activate by discarding a spell card. Vere here can discard to negate every monster your opponent currently controls, Hain can discard to destroy a face-up card, and the Little Crafters can both discard and tribute themselves to summon a big crafter from the deck. As for their spells, they all have one thing in common. During your end phase, if you didn't activate them this turn, and you control a Witchcrafter, you can add them from your graveyard back to your hand. So like, if you discard Creation with Schmitta in order to summon a Witchcrafter out of the deck, then at the end of your turn, you'll get that creation back to your hand, giving you ammo for whatever witch you just summoned. If you just play creation from your hand in order to search a card, like, say, Schmitta, then it just stays in the graveyard. This turn. If you still have a Witchcrafter on the field at the end of your next turn, though, you get to add it back then. Which is why this deck thrives in grind games. First turn, you often have to play a bunch of spells in order to get your board established, meaning you end with like maybe 1 spell in hand. Survive until the next turn though, and you're going to be adding all the spells back to your hand. and continue to do that every subsequent turn, allowing you to maintain resources while your opponents are dwindling. And most of these spells have simple but effective effects. Creation searches a monster, Holiday summons one out of the graveyard, and Unveiling summons one out of the hand, allowing you to get back your big boss monsters if they're removed from the field. The rest of their spells are kind of situational. This one's kind of spell trap removal, but as I said earlier, Schmidta can send them straight to the graveyard by banishing herself from the graveyard. So if you need one in particular, you can just send it, and then you'll recover it during the end phase. It's also worth mentioning that some of these are actually continuous, so they operate slightly different from the normal spells, but they essentially do the same thing. Instead of coming back to your hand, they get placed on the field, and if you would discard for a Witchcrafter, you can send them from the field to the graveyard instead. So yeah, that's the Witchcrafter side of the deck. Basically, just summon out one of your big boss monsters, sit on it, and try to survive long enough to start recurring the resources so you can summon more crafters. As for the Dogmatika engine, they are much simpler. Basically, extra deck monsters are against their religion. They hate the extra deck, and they are designed specifically to fight against it. Ecclesia can summon herself from the hand if there's an extra deck monster on the field, and so can Fleur-de-Lis. Ecclesia searches when summoned, while Fleur negates a monster effect. Their search spell makes you send a monster from the extra deck straight to the graveyard when you activate it, and so does their trap, which targets and destroys a monster your opponent controls. Maximus summons itself from the hand by banishing an extra deck monster from the graveyard, and every turn it can make both players send 2 monsters from their extra deck to the graveyard. There's also Nexus, who can summon itself by banishing 4 extra deck monsters from either player's graveyards. It also mirror forces the opponent when it attacks a special summoned monster, which is not really important to the theme, but it's really fun to do. But yeah, because these guys hate the extra deck so much, and mostly just send it to the graveyard, most of the cards in our extra deck are monsters that do stuff when they're sent to the graveyard. Entis, for example, destroys a card on the field when it's sent there. Skull Knight can pop a monster on the field by banishing itself from the graveyard, which essentially just makes it 2 extra copies of Entis, except they have the slight downside that you can only use them on your turn. Omega can recycle himself from the graveyard along with another card in case you get into grind games, which you often do. Firjeet lets you cycle a card from your hand, which can be good if you're trying to dig into the Witchcrafter half of your deck. And finally, there's Titaniclad, who, at the end of the turn it was sent to the graveyard, lets you take any Dogmatika monster from your deck and either add it to your hand or special summon it to the field. The remaining stuff in our deck is a combination of instant fusion targets. We play a couple of them just because this has some nice synergy with the deck. And also Link 1s that you can summon with your Witchcrafters or Magician's Souls. We play these Link 1s so that we can summon the little Hammer Girl during the first turn. Remember that she can special summon herself from the hand as long as there's an extra deck monster on the field, regardless of who controls it. So if you summon any one of these, you can bring her out for free, and then search Fleur de Lure or your trap. And that's why we play the Magician's Souls at 3, even though it barely does anything on its own. It allows you to make the optimal board if you can get it, which I'll get to in a second, but there's still one more tech card I have to explain, Magician's Restage. This has a summon from the grave effect when it's activated, which can occasionally be useful, but we mostly play it for its second effect. If it's sent to the graveyard, you can search a continuous spell with Magician in its name. Not only can Souls discard this just to draw a card, but your Witchcrafters can discard it to do their things, which means you can get a search pretty reliably. Most of the time you'll be going for Magician's Right Hand, which says, while you control a spellcaster, which all of our monsters are by the way, automatically negate the first spell effect your opponent activates each turn. There's also a Magician's Left Hand that does the same thing for traps, but you normally don't want to search that unless you're sure that you're going against a deck that plays a bunch of traps. But yeah, these are fairly easy to play around if your opponent has multiple spell traps, but they still represent free negation, and if your opponent doesn't deal with them, they get more effective as the duel goes on, just like the Witchcrafters do. And combining them with everything else can make for a pretty formidable board. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and show the optimal opening play, just so you can get an idea of what we're looking at. Alright, so the perfect hand with this deck is Nadir's Servant, Witchcrafter Creation, Magician's Restage, Magician's Souls, and Aruru, all of which we play at 3, so the chances of getting them are higher. Now you want to use Magician Souls first, since a lot of Dogmatika cards actually lock you out of the extra deck after you use them. Summon it by sending another Ruru to the graveyard, and then turn it into Wyncrer. Next, go ahead and activate Farfa's Servant, sending a Titaniclad to search Ecclesia. Since you have your Wyncrer, you can summon Ecclesia, searching her trap. Now you can activate Creation, searching Schmitta, and normal summon her. Schmitta tributes herself and discards Restage to let you get Vere onto the field. This triggers Restage, allowing you to search and then activate the Magician's right hand. Then you can banish Schmitty out of the graveyard to put a Buy Street in the graveyard, and during the end phase, not only will it come back to the field to offer protection, but Titaniclad will activate, allowing you to search Fleur-de-Lis. And there you go! Right Hand negates the first spell your opponent activates, Fleur can summon itself at any point to negate a monster, Buy Street protects Vere from destruction, and she can send it to the graveyard to negate all your opponent's monsters. The trap will destroy a monster, while letting you send Intis for another destruction, or Titaniclad if you want to search in the end phase. We've also got the Wyncrer itself to protect us from battle, another Witchcrafter spell in the graveyard that will add back next turn, and on top of all of that, we have a Ruru in hand, who is actually a pretty interesting hand trap. If any of your spellcasters is targeted by an effect or by battle, you can target a card your opponent controls, or a Witchcrafter spell in your graveyard, return the target to the hand, and then summon a Ruru. She's a pretty beefy 2800 beater that you can get in with during your turn, and then during your opponent's standby phase, she returns to your hand so you can use her again next turn. A lot of pure Witchcrafter decks only play one Ruru since she doesn't really help start their plays, but I find her incredibly useful since she helps protect your Dogmatikas from battle, and helps you in matchups where your opponent is targeting a lot. Like, I've won several games against Altergeist just because of her, because every time they target my stuff to bounce it back to my hand, I summon this and bounce one of them in return, letting me outgrind even the grindiest of control decks. It's also something you can send to the graveyard to activate Magician Soul, so I feel like at least 2 is worth it. But I digress. That was the optimal hand, and if you get it, most decks won't be able to play through like 6 disruptions. It's rare that you do get all that, but as I said earlier, if you can just get 1 or 2 parts of the combo, you should be able to hold off your opponent until you can get everything going. The longer the duel goes on, the more chance you have to come back. And that's pretty much the deck. The side deck is mostly just staple cards you could play in here if you've got the money, or just if you want to make things a little bit more competitive. And then we've got a couple other extra options. I won't go too in-depth, though. The one thing I would suggest is maybe 1 copy of Sky Pegasus at Ignister, since it has a neat graveyard effect that allows you to shuffle cards into the deck. Some nice non-destruction removal. I'd also suggest running 1 extra copy of each of your Witchcrafter bosses, since many decks lose to one or the other in particular, and it can help to double up on one if you're finding that the other is useless. Regardless though, there's the deck. Let me know what you thought about it down in the comments. Like the video if you liked it, I guess dislike it if you don't like it, and subscribe if you want to see more strange deck profiles in general. I do one of these every other week. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, good luck and have fun.